In the last video, we created a simple test that goes to the Todoist homepage, todoist.com, and performs the steps necessary to log into the website. Today, we will go a few steps further, and we will do a few things to make this test more production ready. So first thing I want to do is to make sure that I'm on the latest version of OpenTest. So if I do an OpenTest-V, I can see the version that I'm at. I'm at 0.97. In the meantime, there's a new release that was made available for OpenTest. So I want to make sure to upgrade to that version, and this is actually a best practice. Try to stay up to date, try to stay on the latest version, because this way you make sure to benefit from fixes and new features that are being added. So let's update OpenTest. So we'll do npm install OpenTest-G. So we are now at version 0.9.14. Good. So let's close this and let's proceed with the next steps. So if you remember, in the last video we created a directory called OpenTest, where we put the test repository and the working directories for the test actor and the OpenTest server. We will now start both the server and the test actor to get prepared to run tests. So I'll copy the path to the server working directory, and there are a couple of ways to start the server. One way would be to change directory into this working directory and to type OpenTest server. The other way to do this would be to type OpenTest server and then the path to the working directory for the server. And let's use this one this time. So I started the server, and now let's start the actor. And the same story applies to the actor. We can do OpenTest actor and then the working directory for the actor. The server and the actor are now started, so I can connect to the server just to see the UI, make sure everything looks good. All right, so we have all of the test sessions that we had created in the previous session. So let's continue with our test suite. This test that we wrote the last time performs the login to the application, but we know that we will have to perform the steps for login many times in our tests. So what we want to do is we want to extract this login functionality and encapsulate it in a piece of logic that can be called over and over for every test, every time that we need it to be performed. The way to do that in OpenTest is by using something called a macro action. So macros are just a way to encapsulate a series of test actions under one single name that can be then referenced in multiple tests. And rather than me talking about it, let me show you how to do it, and you'll understand much better. So first of all, in the root of the test repository, we'll have to create a new directory called macros. And this name is mandatory, the same as the name for the tests directory. So it has to be called macros because this is how OpenTest knows where to look for macro actions. And in this macros directory, I will create a new file called login.yaml, because our macro will perform a login action. Naturally, I want to call it login so people know what this is. And the format for the macro is very similar to the format for the test, which is why I will copy everything we have in the test and I will put it as such in the macro. The only difference for the macro is that there is no concept of a test segment, and I also don't need to specify what actor performs the actions, because this information will be coming from the test that calls this macro. So I fixed the indentation, so this looks okay now. So let's save this. And now in the test, let me put this file on the right side here, just so you can see the files side by side. So in my test now, I don't need to perform all of these steps. Instead of everything that I had before, I can simply run one single test action, and to specify that I want to run a macro, I simply say macro, and then I have to say the name of the macro, and the name of my macro is login.yaml. But of course all files are YAML, so I don't need to specify the extension of the file. Now if this file was in a subdirectory, let's say maybe I want to create another directory in the macros subfolder 1. If this macro resided in this subdirectory, then I will have had to say subfolder 1 here. Either I can use a dot for separating the path elements, or I can use a slash. I usually prefer the dot just to stay consistent with the syntax we use for specifying test action names. Alright, but we don't need to put it in a subfolder. Let's leave it in the root, and let's get rid of this folder. So all I need to do is to specify the name of the login, and now the login macro. So let's duplicate this test session and let's see what happens now. So my test session started. We should see the browser any minute. Yeah, it navigated to the home page, it logs in. Wrong email or password. Remember I told you I will change my password. Well, I need to update the password in the test file. So let's run the test session and let's see what happens. So we duplicate the test session that we ran the last time, which only contains this one test. Click on create session to run it. The browser should come up any minute. It navigates to the home page, enters the login credentials, and it succeeded. So the test still works, but if we look at the execution log, if we look in here, we'll see all the actions that executed. At the very end here, we see macro login. Basically, this means that all of these actions that executed up to here are part of this login macro. So the work that was performed was exactly the same as before, but now everything is nicely encapsulated in this macro action. And now this macro can be reused over and over again in multiple tests. The second thing we need to do to bring this a little bit closer to production readiness is to extract all of the element locators from this test into separate files. And we do that because typically when as an application is being changed, element locators become stale and they need to be modified. But if you use an element locator in a large number of tests, it becomes very cumbersome to update that locator in all of those tests. So what you want to do is you want to store the locator in a separate data file and then reference that locator from the data file in all of the tests that use that particular UI element. So let's see how to do that. To start with, we need to create a new data file that will store the locators. Data files in OpenTest need to reside in a separate directory called data. And just like with tests and with the macros directories, data is also a mandatory name. It has to be called data. And in this data directory, we will create a new file called locators.yaml. So let me close the test and let me bring the macro into this left panel. So what I want to do now is I want to move all of these locators into the data file. How do we do that? So in here we can define however many data properties we want. So first one will be a property that will hold the locator for the login menu, right? So I could say login menu, and I could assign it this value. Let me close the sidebar so you can see everything. And I save the data file. And in here now, instead of specifying the locator directly, I can use the syntax $data of locators dot, and this the name of this property dot login menu. So this syntax that you see here basically means go into the locators data file, and from that locators data file read the property called login menu. And this is basically a nice and concise way to reference this value in here. Now in this case I want to do one more thing. There will be a lot of locators in this file, and to make it a bit more readable, I want to organize it on multiple levels. So I want to put all of the locators that all of the locators for the elements in the home page in a separate under a separate property name. So we'll call that property homepage, and then we'll indent this so that YAML knows that the login menu is a property of this homepage object. So right now all of the properties that we will define will have to be at the same level. Property 2 with value 2, property 3 with value 3, so on and so forth. And all of these properties will be children of this homepage level or object. And then in the macro, when I refer to that data property, I will do .homepage.login menu. And I can use however many levels I want here, but my recommendation would be to use no more than 2. Otherwise, this will become hard to read. All right, so let's go to the second locator. So second locator is the one for the first iframe in the page. So let's call it first iframe. And the other thing is, whenever you define properties in a data file, make sure to organize them alphabetically. This accomplishes 2 things. First, it makes it easier to locate the property manually. Second, it avoids merge conflicts in source control. So when you have a large team that makes modifications in the same data file, many times you run the risk of merge conflicts when two or more team members change the same line in the file. If you organize the properties alphabetically, this risk is minimized, not eliminated, but minimized. All right, so we have the first iframe property, and then we'll have to reference it in a similar way. All right, for the second iframe, we'll do the same. So let's duplicate this and move it below. Call it second iframe. The locator for the second iframe will be, okay, so what I thought was the first iframe is actually the second iframe. So let's call this second iframe. And now the locator for the first iframe, yeah, I didn't use a locator here. You know what, let's change it into a locator. And we want to reference the frame by name, and the name is GB frame. And now let's store this under this property here, and then in the macro action we will reference this data property. All right, what else we have here? The email address. Okay, so let's call this email text, email input. And the locator for the email input will be this, and then in here we will reference the email input property. Okay, now the password, we will do something similar. Okay, so this is where it belongs, password input. The password input has this locator, and then we copy and paste this here, and we put password input in here. So the last thing is the login button. So login button belongs here. The locator looks like this, and then we will reference the property from the data file like this. We save, and let's save the data file too. And now let's test that our test still runs correctly. Perfect, our test passed. So we successfully took all of the locators and put them in an external data file. And our test repository looks like this. We have the test file, we have the login macro, and then we have the locators YAML data file. This actually looks more like what you should see in production, right? So if I create a second test now, let's call it test login number 2. Now both of these test files, let me close the login macro. Both of these test files use the login macro, and I can create a test session that runs both of the tests, and they will both make use of the same functionality. Now, because both of those tests use the same login macro, I can simply go into the macro and make the changes that I need. Or if the flow of the login remains the same, but only the locator of one of the elements changes, I can go into the locators data file and I can change that locator in there, and my tests will still run correctly. I hope you enjoyed this session, and I'll see you in the next episode.